Everyone knows that Israel feared the Canaanites because they were called the giants in the scriptures, right? But almost nobody realized that those giants were actually real people, not giants like figments of our imaginations or giants like in fairy tales, but tall Upper Nile warrior classes, fortified cities, organized and living in the very land Shem was supposed to inherit. Tall warrior groups. So think of tall warrior groups. I understand that these are tall people. And here's the part that flips the whole story, really, when you think about it. Abraham didn't fight against the Canaanites. He lived among them and he fought with them side by side as allies, his main allies, actually, to rescue Lot. We read the story about Lot going and getting rescued and the ties going to Melchizedek. Well, he was fighting with the Canaanites, not against the Canaanites. So Israel and Canaan weren't racial enemies. They weren't hating each other and all that kind of thing. But they lived together, trusted each other, and even went to war as partners. I know it's hard to conceive of that because of what we're told about the curse of Canaan. I'm going to get into that in a minute. But the real conflict was between Israel and Canaan, but it was never about identity. It was about land. It was about a covenant boundary set in the days of Noah. And Jubilees says that Canaan, that's the Book of Jubilees, which is extra canonical, but it's a great book. Worth reading, by the way. Jubilees says that Canaan trespassed into the center of Shem's inheritance, right? That Noah loved and thought was the best land in the center of the land. To me, I take that as the equator, the land that's neither hot nor cold. So I take that to be somewhere in the Kenya, Uganda, maybe the Congo area, but up in that area, even into South Sudan or South Ethiopia. So anyway, along the equatorial part of Africa. That act triggered a territorial curse, not a biological one. I think if we can remember that this curse was not biological. It wasn't like they were made into small people or tall people or big people or small people. They weren't. It was about the land that they stole. I assume because they were large, they could, but they stole the land from Shem and refused to give it up. But because of that, they were cursed, but not a biological curse. It was a curse about land. So centuries later, when Israel approached the land, they saw these towering fortified cities. We hear the basket going up and Rahab and all those stories. And the 7 days of walking around the cities and with Jericho and that kind of thing. But that we are realizing that these people were a warrior people with fortified cities. And what had happened earlier, the spies had panicked to see these people. They were giants in the land. Think of Goliath type. They were larger than the normal human being. It doesn't mean that they were towering 25, 50 feet high. But even if they were 6 inches higher or a foot higher than the norm, then that would qualify them to be giants, in my opinion. So the spies that went into the land, we know of the spies, right? We know that Joshua and Caleb went into the land with 10 others, and they came back with a bad report, except for Caleb and Joshua, who said, we can do it, let's go into the land. But the other 10 spies were fearful and cowering, and it made all the people scared, in my opinion. And what did Moses say? Or God say to the people? Okay, that's all right. Boot camp for you. 40 years into the wilderness, you're going to go because you need to get prepared to go in to take this land. It's the land that I've given you. So these spies were describing fortified cities, tall, huge, and warrior types. It wasn't looking like an easy land, great land. They said it was great land, and they brought back grapes and that kind of thing. But they also were scared to death of these people because they could see that they were great warriors. And so they panicked and they retreated, and as I said, spent 40 years in the wilderness. But Abraham's alliance with the peoples of Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre that we read about in the Bible proves something crucial, that Israel and Canaan were intertwined peoples. They shared cities in the end. They shared battles. They shared marriages. The wars of Joshua and David were not about, wiping out certain peoples down to the last person, because we see even by the time of David, the Jebusites are living among them. So, but it was about something else. They were doing covenant enforcement. If we go back to the Book of Jubilees, the Canaanites were cursed not because of who they were as a people, not even because some people think they were wicked or all that kind of thing. No, they were cursed because their leader chose to lead them into living in someone else's land, to breaking a barrier, a land contract that was set by covenant at the time of Noah. So when Joshua, all the way down through David, are enforcing getting the land back, they're actually restoring Shem's land that was stolen by Canaan back to them. And Canaan so then took, because Canaan had taken the center of the land. So Joshua's armies coming in, Moses, then Joshua, and then later on down through. It was about land restoration or a covenant restoration. And so even after David conquered Jerusalem, then we can read that the Jebusites were still there, even though they mocked them and had their battles. When they were conquered, the Jebusites still lived in the city of Jerusalem. They weren't killed down to the last child. They lived among the people forever. I mean, they weren't gone. So they lived in the city, and they were not expelled, as I said. They weren't erased. They weren't in any way dealt with in that manner. And the final proof is that Israel and Canaan were neighbors, because we see that even by the time of David, which was hundreds of years after Joshua, we still see these two peoples living together in the land. We know that Judah and Simeon married Canaanite women. We know that Abraham lived among them. Probably some of the other sons, I believe probably all the other sons other than Joseph, probably, and maybe Benjamin, but I think they probably all married into Canaanite women because they were living among Canaanite peoples. So it's a complicated thing, but the curse has to do with land. And when the land was taken back and the people were moved and David and them got the lands back, or most of them, then did the curse continue to remain upon the people or upon the land? No, because the land was back in the possession of the people that were supposed to go and get it. So they were neighbors, marriage partners, allies, rivals, of course, in war with one another, of course. But the struggle came from one act, and that act was Canaan stealing Shem's land and Shem coming down through the people of Abraham to retake the land. I want to go back into the part I was talking about Abraham, because we see that we're talking hundreds of years before Joshua, hundreds even years before all the conquest and all that. Abraham is living among the Canaanites. And we see that Isaac's son Esau marries into the Canaanites, and we see Abraham's kids and all that kind of stuff going on. But the issue is they were not looked as like a race that was less than Abraham or another race. Now, did Abraham send a servant back to get a marriage set up with his own people for Isaac? Yes, that happened. Same as Isaac sending Jacob to get a wife from the Shemites. It didn't work out. He got tricked, of course, as we know. But if we're going back to these chiefs, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, Genesis names three Amorite leaders, okay, and calls them the allies of Abraham. Not servants, not subordinates, allies. They were his allies when they went to war to rescue Lot and his family and his inheritance and that kind of thing, and bring back the riches. And then, of course, went to Melchizedek and gave the tithe. These are the men he went to war with, not against, but with, was the Canaanites. So Abraham didn't have an army. He had his group, of course, but he didn't have thousands and thousands. He arrived there as a household, his wife and a few others. But to survive in this land, he needed alliances, and he had alliances with the Canaanites. We know how he treated them so well, paying properly for everything, for the land and burial spots and all that kind of thing. But we see this invasion of the Eastern kings, and they come, it's like a regional war. So it's not just against Abraham and it's just not Lot that's taken or Abraham's threatened. It's this whole area. And he joins in this multi-nation clan, whatever you want to call it, army that goes out and conquers these Eastern kings. And he's doing that with who? With the Canaanites, with the Canaanite chiefs. So they basically had a military force between them. It says that they pursued the invaders north, divided their forces at night, and struck with precision. Lot was rescued, the captives freed, and the goods recovered, and the invaders defeated. So that was Israel, before Israel, but let's say Abraham plus Canaan, they make a victory together. And I think that's fascinating, because we then see the time of Moses, they're at war with one another. But at this time, they are allies. But what it does show, I think it's so crucial to understand, especially for my viewers there of the Nilotic groups that live in, I think, the area of Kenya, Sudan, all that through that area. If these are your forefathers, and I have no way of proving that they are or not, but if Canaan was there, that would make sense that they're your ancestors. Yes, some Bantu people moved in over time into the area, but the Nilotic area, that's that area. And if they are the Canaanites, which possibly they are, but the issue is they were never put down as a people, like that they were inferior in any way ethnically. Yes, their father had long ago, almost 1,000 years before Abraham, had stolen land, but that curse had to be rectified. But it didn't mean the people themselves were wicked or something wrong with them. It just means that they were living in someone else's house. The householder wanted their land back. So Abraham's life proves that the conflict was never ethnic. He trusted the Canaanites. He fought alongside them, as I said. Judah and Simeon married with the Canaanites. Most of the other boys, I think, also married with the Canaanites. And I've done a video on the mixed multitude. Was Jesus from mixed multitude? Because we also see Rahab, who's Canaanite, who helps them get over the walls. We see Moabites coming in. So strangers come in among Israel, okay? And they certainly had lots of wives at the very beginning. Joseph married into Mizraim in Egypt. So Ephraim and Manasseh are both half from Egypt and half from Shem. And the same for the Canaanites, wives marrying into Judah and Simeon. I know by the A1E1A thing, that's through patrilineal. But if we were able to do a check matrilineal on the line, we would find that the wives were from Ham because they were from Canaanite or they were from Mizraim. In the Joshua part, which I alluded to earlier, Joshua after Moses, or at Moses and then with Joshua, that whole time frame, they weren't entering into some foreign world, right? Like I said, they had already married in with these people. They already knew who they were. It wasn't like they didn't know. They're just sent down. But I do think they might have been surprised at how fortified the cities were by the time they got there after a lot of years, right? Almost 400 years from Abraham to Moses, 430, I guess, or whatever. So yes, they had fortified the land. So when they came into the land, it was like much more fortified, I suppose, than what their ancestors remembered. But they were entering land that they'd already lived in. Abraham had already lived there. They knew the land. They didn't have possession of the land, but they knew the land. But now it was fortified, it was elevated, it was dominated by tall warriors, not the ones that Abraham knew anymore, but this is hundreds of years later, but still a warrior class, tall warriors, which is what the spies said. The spies saw the height of the warriors and the size of the cities and collapsed psychologically. We were like grasshoppers in their sight. Okay, so they were terrified. Does it mean they were a foot higher, half a foot higher, 2 feet higher? I don't know, but they were definitely higher, enough that maybe they exaggerated about grasshoppers, but they certainly were not monsters. They were regular people like you or I, just maybe taller. But after 40 years in the wilderness, when they came back, they weren't these scared spies anymore. Those people died away, except for Caleb and Joshua. And they came into the land as what? As fighters that were able to take on the people that were already there in the land and conquer the land. So they feared 40 years earlier, but when they came in, they hadn't grown anymore being in the wilderness on manna. I think they were still the same size, but their hearts had changed and they trusted that the Father wanted them to take that land and he would be with them. And we read the stories with Moses, with his arms being held up and all that kind of thing. But we do know that Father sent them because the covenant of Abraham is that they would take back the land of Canaan, because it wasn't Cain's land. It was that was part of the covenant that Abraham would go in to fulfill, or his family. So in the wilderness, Israel hardened into a nation capable of facing cities that were fortified with walls, right? So as I said, when you get to the story of the Jericho, and I've done videos on Jericho in the Levant or modern day Palestine, that area, and the archaeologists cannot find walls at the time of Joshua. They cannot find walls that fell down or the size of the walls. They do find some walls that have collapsed over time, but they were not from the time of Joshua. So then you go, okay, well, maybe that wasn't the Jericho they went into. At least that's how I believe. Because, of course, I believe Jericho was actually in Africa. And as they were coming down from Sudan into South Sudan, somewhere in there, I think we'll find there was a Jericho. But the issue was they had fortified walls. So Rahab, when they let down the basket, it wasn't just a 4-foot wall. I don't know how tall it was, but I would assume at least a 20-foot wall, 15, 20-foot wall, 30-foot, I don't know. But they were strong, hard. They couldn't just go through them, even though they were numerous peoples, the Israelites, by the time they came in, the 12 tribes. But they couldn't conquer that without the miracle of destroying those walls after the seventh day, or on the seventh day. So in this time that they detoured, as I did in my video with the Green Sahara, after they left Egypt, then they spent, in my opinion, 40 years up in the Sahara, up wandering, getting manna from heaven, but they were strengthened. Those were not easy times for them. So by the time they came down into the land, they didn't fear the height of their enemies quite so much. So again, getting to the point, Joshua was not after some kind of cleansing or some kind of getting rid of everybody that has a certain genome or something like that. No, he was after the land. That was the covenant of Abraham, that they would take back the land that was their land. So they weren't stealing, and I think people forget this. They were not stealing Canaan's land. It's not like Heavenly Father or Father said, hey, I don't like that guy, so go take his land. He didn't say, go take Egypt's land, or go take Shem's other lands, or go take the lands of the Philistines. No, he said, I want you to take those lands, the lands of the Canaanites, because they're your lands. You're just going back. Squatters basically are on your land, and you can go in and take the land back. In the end, they didn't take it all back. And then, of course, as we know, they lived for hundreds of years among the Canaanites and did all their days. In the ancient world, I didn't know this, but it's interesting. The land was the inheritance. Boundaries were actually sacred, which we see spelled out in Jubilees. So taking another clan or nation's or tribe's lands invoked treaty curses, or curses as we see in the Book of Jubilee or in the Bible. They actually had boundary stone laws. Okay, so to move a stone that was a boundary stone was completely illegal and, would cause wars and that kind of thing, of course. So Joshua's targets were strategic. Jericho, Ai, Hazor, Lachish, each a foothold in Shem's land. As I said, they weren't not conquering Egypt's lands or Cush's lands or Put's lands or other people's lands. They were going into Canaanite lands because it was their land. So even after Joshua's victories, the Canaanite groups, as I said, they remained. And we see that with David hundreds of years later. And they lived among them. They traded with Israel. And in the end, they intermarried. Even Solomon, we see intermarrying again, too. Now, was Israel counseled not to marry with the Canaanites? Of course. Why? Because the Canaanite gods that they worshipped were not the same as the gods of Israel, not the same as the one God that Israel was told to worship, and the laws and all that kind of thing. So marrying outside foreign women or strange women was forbidden because it made everybody become like the people you're marrying into, which is what happened with Solomon. He married all the strange wives, and he became strange to God himself and lost his place and lost the kingdom right after that. It was divided in two, and then lost tribes were taken away, and then Judah was taken to Babylon, all because what? Solomon and David, really, they married these strange women. They brought in these foreign things. They started worshiping Baal and Asherah and Moloch and all these things, which they were commanded. And you see the prophets, if you read any of the Old Testament, what are the prophets always talking about? Israel and Judah are what? Worshiping these Baal priests and Baal things and all these foreign gods and forgetting the one true God. And so they are breaking their covenant, just as Canaan broke a covenant over land. The interesting story, I went over this in my video on Jerusalem, but it's interesting that when David went up to conquer with a lot of soldiers to conquer Jerusalem at the time, which was controlled by the Jebusites, they were mocking him like, yeah, just our children and our old men and and our women could take care of keeping us safe in this city against you guys. But in the end, they did conquer the city, but they didn't kill all the Jebusites. The Jebusites lived, as I said, among David. I'll put a scripture here for that, but he lived among them the whole time. They never were not living among the Jebusites. So David, of course, was cagey, and he came up through a water shaft. He didn't attack them in the walls because they probably couldn't have ever gotten through the walls, as the Romans had a hard time, and many peoples had a hard time attacking Jerusalem. But it was sacked, as I said, it was sacked by the Babylonians. Romans were in there, so it wasn't impossible. But David, he went under the walls, and then was able to open up the gates. So Jerusalem fell by stratagem, right? And not by brute force in that sense. When I did the video on Jerusalem being up on a high mountain, one of the things that came up as I was researching, I didn't put it in the video, was that this threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, and it says that David buys this threshing floor from Araunah, the Jebusite, and he paid him full price. So it wasn't like he just stole his land. He paid full price. Okay. And think about it, is that how someone treats someone that's your enemy you just conquered? No, he paid the land, he paid for the full price. But the interesting thing is that to have those kind of threshing floors, they had to have a lot of wind coming up there. When we read about Aristeas and Jerusalem, the curtains of the temple were always moving because it was built in that high place of the air. Moving up through was great for doing the grain, but it was also great for the temple as well. So think about the Jebusites. They were what? They were absorbed within Israel, right? They intermarried. They ended up being absorbed, really. And they were there, and I assume some of them are still living there to this day in that land, wherever it is. Yeah, sure, they might have moved here or there. But I think that's one of the things we forget about. We talk just about the Bantu movement, which is true. Great, huge movement there. But we don't really read about what happened after the lost tribes went out, who took their land, who came in. And when I did the video on Aristeas, we see that he even mentioned that some of the land and peoples had moved into some of the land. But even by the time of Aristeas, 250 years before Christ, the land of Judah at the time, or Judeans, how big was it? He said about in acres, I think it was 60 million acres, but it was worked out to be about 93,000 square miles. So not even half the size of a Kenya today, maybe almost between a third and half the size of a Kenya. So they weren't this huge people that were running all of Africa. They were living in a certain geographical area. Now, have I figured that out? No, I haven't. And I love all the comments about that. But they did live in an area, whether you think it's Namibia, or you think it's Lesotho, or you think it's in the Congo, or up in Ethiopia, northern Ethiopia area, or you think it's in southern Ethiopia, or Kenya, or wherever. Still, remember that 250 years before Christ, Judean, that whole area of Judea, was about not even the size of half of Kenya. So wherever we're trying to picture the lands of Israel and the peoples of Israel, remember they are not the whole continent, in my opinion. It's just not even logical. I'm doing a video right after this on that. But the issue is Jerusalem merged two peoples, the Jebusites and the Israelites who took it. And they didn't wipe them all out. And they were still trading with many other Canaanite nations, even up through the time of Solomon and onward. So peoples just didn't disappear. So for me, if you were looking for, in that whole area, wherever you think Israel once was, who should you find there? You should still find Moabites and Ammonites and Esau and Ishmaelites and Perizzites. I'll put the list here, but just of the Canaanites, there's like 25 or 30 groups. Then there's some Shem-based peoples that lived around, like Moab and Ammon and and the Midianites. All those people still in Africa, or their seed is still there in wherever they might be. Maybe they aren't all living in exactly the same place, because people do move. We see that the Khoisan were moved down further south, and we see the Bantus moved into the areas where the Pygmies were to some degree, and all that kind of thing. Just remember that from Abraham's alliances at the beginning with Canaan, through Joshua's restoration of the land, taking the land, and to David sharing Jerusalem, Yes, there were terrible batters. Yes, there were some cities where there was one city where God told them, Saul, to wipe out every person that was in that city for that reason that they had against whatever they'd done. That city was to be destroyed. But they didn't do that for every city that they went into, right? We'd see that because David did not do that. And David was right after Saul, and he didn't kill every Jebusite and steal everybody's land. He conquered the city, yes, but they lived among the Jebusites, and he paid money for the piece of land where the temple was built. So they were living side by side in a land of Shem. Yes, it was Canaanite land because Canaan took it, but it was really the land of Shem. But they were bound together by what? By family, by history. I don't believe there was any other group other than maybe Cush to some degree, but there was no other group that lived among or with or had dealings with the Israelites more than the Canaanites. They were basically, they were hooked up peoples in many ways. And yes, they had the things saying don't marry into them and all that, but they did it anyway. So the struggle between them was never about identity. And I want to make this point because I've heard this discussion. I don't want to say where, but I think it's important to just, the Canaanites were not Pygmies, okay? The Pygmies are their own group of people, an honorable people like every other honorable people. But it says right in the scriptures that the Canaanites were large, scary large people. They weren't Pygmies, okay? The Pygmies are another people living in the Congo and down through that area. And we went over that in the last video about their different genetic makeup as the Khoisan as well. But to say that these pygmies were once these giants, that doesn't make sense. If you look at the Nilo-Saharan peoples of our day, even now, they are known as being large people, very tall race. And so that makes sense because that's where they lived. That's more or less where I think the area was. But to say that people are Canaanites because we dislike them or we think this of them or that of them, it doesn't make sense. I mean, I don't know why we think these things. It disturbs me, to be honest. I need to say that because we see that Abraham lived among them and went to war with them. He didn't go to war with pygmies. He went to war with tall warrior, tough men. And then what else? They married. I don't know why people forget this, but Simeon and Judah married into the Canaanites. So do you think that they were marrying people that were much shorter than they were? It makes no logical sense. And I think it's great to learn African history. I'm not even African, and I love the African history, and I love to try to shine a light on some things that are false. So we can start to say, okay, let's just look at it instead of using scriptures and ideas and saying, so instead of demeaning people, I think it's so important. I had this comment, I'm not going to put the person's name by it, but I had this comment on my last video where the A1E1A includes all the people that would be considered Shem, which is the Bantu, the Ibu, the Yoruba, and all the peoples that came from them over 5,000 years. And I put this down, or a person commented that Esau was not of that group. He was E1B. And I'm going like, even some of the other people watching the video said, how can that be? He was born from the same, that you don't just, because we don't just make genetics, you're E1B because I don't like you. You're of Ham because I don't like you or whatever. No, Esau was African. He was not European. He wasn't white European. Esau was in Africa just as much as Jacob was in Africa and Abraham was in Africa. And I do my best to try to put down images that try to show who the Bible people are. But at the same time, we can't then just take one group and say, oh, but they're all the Europeans. I mean, it's just like we have to use logic, and we have to use what wasn't maybe given to you, because the Africans have been terribly mistreated by Europeans and the colonial nations, no doubt about it. But at the same time, we don't need to go and have the heart that they have. We need to keep, or you need to keep, not we, but I just believe that you, as a wonderful people of Shem, need to keep your heart grounded in reality and the kindness and the love and mercy that I see in all the people that make the comments on my show. And I really appreciate that. And thanks for all the comments you do put down. They really make it easier for me to do research and see things through a different lens. And I hope, as a foreigner, an outsider, a stranger in the midst, that I can give a different look because I don't see Ham like some people see Ham, and I don't see the Fulani in the same way others see them because of tribal problems and hundreds of years of conflict and terrible things that have happened, or the Yoruba against the Bantu, or the Bantu against the Ibu, and all these things, they're real, they happened, just as much the colonial powers have happened. But at the same time, we can't then go back in time and say, nope, just this one group, just this one group of Esau, they're now Europeans instead of Africans, and they're not E1, they're not A1, E1B anymore. Nope, we're going to change them into another group because we can't have them be part of our group. And it's like, that's not logical. Okay, the Khoisan, they have their own group. And Pygmies have their own group that's genetic. And the people that I consider Shem, they have their own group. And whether you like one of the relatives that grew up in that group doesn't matter. They're still in that group. And the B group, the Afro-Asiatic group from up north in the more like the Ham Cushite areas, they are who they are too. And maybe they have a people they didn't like. Maybe they didn't like the Philistines. They can't just say, oh, no, the Philistines are not part of us. We're going to put them down with the Shemite people because we don't want them. We have to use what's fair. And because other than that, we just get into falsehoods. So saying the Canaanites are Pygmies is just a blatant falsehood and embarrassing falsehood. And I think it's important that we are factual. I try in my show to be as factual as I can and try to come at it from the way maybe Diop. I mean, he was factual. He knew that the pharaohs were black in Egypt. But he didn't just make claims. He went and found the information to prove that. So if you believe that the Canaanites of today are the Pygmies, then you better bring records and you better bring proof, not just throw these things out there, because it really harms the discourse, in my opinion, that people in Africa should be having about their wonderful, probably the best heritage in the world, and arguing about who's this and who's that and this is that. It doesn't help the argument. I think it's time for generosity and calmness, the opposite of the colonial powers, and to show the great heart that Africa truly has. Because remember, Canaan stole land. They were cursed for land, not cursed because they were bad people, that every person for thousands of years that was born from Canaan is somehow cursed. It is not factual. It doesn't make sense anymore. And I'll put this out there for the Israelites who are waking up now, the dry bones, waking up all over the world, wherever they've been dispersed. If you go, were you cursed? Yes, your fathers were cursed. Why? Deuteronomy 28, because they broke the covenant. Well, so did they break the land covenant in Canaan. But does that mean all their ancestors forevermore, that God despises them? It's not even logical, nor is it what the Father's heart, in my opinion, is. He is, like all Africans that I have known, merciful, kind, generous, and all those things. And he would expect the same. But yet at the same time, he curses people to make them make things right. He's not cursing them as, forever. He's going like a father to a child. You did this wrong. You need to fix it. If you're not going to fix it, you're going to have to suffer the consequences until this gets fixed. I mean, to me, it's very simple, but I know it's not so easy. But enough about Canaan, and I really appreciate all your kind words on my channel and all your thoughts. If you feel to join, I'm going to start having some lives, I hope, in the next week or two. But if you feel to join the channel down below, please do so. And please leave a comment, for good or for bad. Please leave a comment and a like on the video. Thanks for being with me today. And here's the video I just did previously. And I'll put another one here that might be interesting to you. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.